A frozen field in Flanders, the morning of December 25, 1914. British soldiers peer over the parapet and see, impossibly, German troops climbing out of their trenches unarmed, hands raised, shouting in broken English. The stench of cordite and death still hangs in the air, but so does the sound of a ball being kicked on frozen mud. No orders authorized this. No general planned it. Across the Western Front, thousands of men simply stopped killing each other and walked into no man's land. Some carried letters from home, others carried a football. That single day captures the hidden history of the game. A force capable of suspending industrialized slaughter, and a tinderbox that ignites wars, overthrows governments, and masks atrocity. How does a sport become a weapon, a lifeline, and a lie all at once? Today, 10 moments where football collided with history's darkest machinery. Before we begin, tell us in the comments where you're watching from and subscribe, so you make it all the way to the #1 spot. Now let's start the countdown. The 1914 Christmas Truce football match. By December 1914, the Western Front had frozen into a continuous line of trenches from the North Sea to Switzerland. 5 months of war had produced a stalemate, and in the week before Christmas, an extraordinary grassroots ceasefire began to spread. Roughly 100,000 British and German troops stopped shooting. The mechanism was simple: proximity and exhaustion. Trenches were sometimes only 30 meters apart, and soldiers on both sides were worn down by the same mud, cold, and loss. Informal truces had already flickered in quiet sectors, men shouting greetings, exchanging newspapers, recovering bodies, but Christmas amplified it. On Christmas Eve, Germans placed candles on their parapets and sang carols. The British joined in. Then, in daylight, men climbed out unarmed. They exchanged food, tobacco, buttons, and in several places, they kicked a ball around. No one knows exactly where the first match happened or who won. The accounts are fragmentary. A leather football produced from somewhere, a chaotic game with no referee, sometimes a mass kickabout rather than a structured match. The significance lies in the psychology. These men had been trying to kill each other hours before. Now they were playing football in no man's land. The sport bridged the gap because it was a shared language. Many Germans had worked in Britain and followed the football leagues. It was a spontaneous act of humanity, not organized by officers. In fact, commanders on both sides were horrified. Brigadier General Walter Congreve watched reluctantly, fearing snipers. The truce allowed burial parties to retrieve the dead, and joint services were held. But the football became its most enduring symbol. The war did not end. The truce was never repeated. On this scale, orders from high command in 1915 forbade any fraternization, and the battles of that year, with their massive casualties, hardened the men. The football match of 1914 was a brief, fragile moment when the logic of war was suspended by the logic of a game. The 1969 football war between El Salvador and Honduras. On July 14, 1969, the Salvadoran military launched a two-front invasion of its neighbor. The war lasted just 100 hours. Its nickname came from rioting during a World Cup qualifier, but the real engine was demographic pressure and land. El Salvador had 3.5 million people, squeezed into a territory 5 times smaller than Honduras, whose population was 2.6 million. Over 300,000 Salvadorans had migrated into Honduras, many squatting on unused land. In 1967, Honduras enforced a land reform law that confiscated plots occupied by immigrants and redistributed them to native-born citizens. Thousands of Salvadoran families were expelled. The human displacement created a political crisis that diplomacy could not absorb. When the two nations met for a qualifier in June 1969, the stadiums became pressure valves. In Tegucigalpa, Honduran fans harassed the Salvadoran team all night. In San Salvador, a dirty rag was hoisted instead of the Honduran flag. Riots left several dead. Each match escalated the stakes, not because football caused the war, but because it gave a face and a crowd to a pre-existing structural fuse. El Salvador dissolved diplomatic ties on June 26th, citing mass expulsions. Border skirmishes followed with anti-aircraft fire and mortar exchanges. The war itself was a rapid, improvised affair. The Salvadoran Air Force struck first, using World War II-era P-51 Mustangs and civilian cargo planes hastily rigged as bombers. Columns of M3A1, Stuart light tanks, and bulldozers with welded-on steel plates pushed along the Pan American Highway and toward the Sula Valley. The Honduran Air Force retaliated with F-4U Corsairs, destroying 20% of El Salvador's fuel reserves in a single day. The only major ground battle saw Salvadoran troops surround Nueva Ocotepeque, taking the town after artillery barrages. Then both offensives stalled, ammunition ran low, resistance stiffened. A ceasefire, brokered by the Organization of American States, took effect at midnight on July 18th. Salvadoran troops withdrew in early August under threat of sanctions. The war killed several hundred people and displaced tens of thousands more. It also marked the last time piston-engined fighters dueled in combat. The underlying land crisis remained unsolved, feeding grievances that would ignite the Salvadoran Civil War a decade later. The 1990 Dinamo Zagreb, Red Star Belgrade riot. On May 13, 1990, at Maksimir Stadium in Zagreb, a football match between Dinamo Zagreb and Red Star Belgrade descended into ethnic violence that foreshadowed the Yugoslav Wars. Weeks earlier, Croatia's first multi-party elections in almost 50 years had brought nationalist parties to power, heightening tensions. The rivalry between the two top clubs was already fierce, but now it was a proxy for the conflict between Croatian independence and Serbian centralism. Approximately 3,000 Delije, Red Star's hardcore fans, traveled to Zagreb, many led by Željko Ražnatović, known as Arkan, a wanted criminal who would soon command a paramilitary unit responsible for crimes against humanity. The Delije began tearing up advertising plates and attacking Dinamo fans with seats, chanting Serbian nationalist slogans. When bad Blue Boys, Dinamo's supporters, tried to storm the pitch, police beat them back with batons and tear gas. The situation escalated because the police were too lenient with the Delije early on, allowing them to breach the segregated area. The bad Blue Boys then overwhelmed the police, and the stadium descended into a pitched battle involving armored vans and water cannons. Amid the chaos, Dinamo captain Zvonimir Boban kicked a police officer who was mistreating a Dynamo fan, an act that made him a Croat nationalist symbol and got him suspended for 6 months. Over 60 people were wounded, some stabbed or shot. The riot exposed how football fan groups had become paramilitary structures, with members later fighting in the wars. The Yugoslav First League collapsed within a year as Slovenia and Croatia declared independence. The match did not start the war, but it showed that ethnic hatred had already militarized the terraces. The Football War of 1990 between Cameroon and Nigeria. March 1990, a World Cup qualifier in Yaoundé. The two nations had a simmering border dispute over the Bakassi Peninsula, an oil-rich strip of land. Diplomatic relations were already frayed. When the indomitable Lions hosted the Super Eagles, the stadium became a proxy battlefield. Cameroon took the lead early. Nigerian fans alleged biased officiating. Tensions snapped. A pitch invasion by Cameroonian supporters sparked a stampede. Nigerian players and officials were attacked. The match ended in a 1-0 victory for Cameroon. But the real score was written in casualties. Over 20 people injured. The violence spilled beyond the stadium. Nigerian nationals in Cameroon faced reprisals. The geopolitical logic was simple. A football match offered a low-risk arena to assert national dominance, but the crowd's psychology turned it into a high-stakes confrontation. The referee lost control, and the state's monopoly on violence dissolved for 90 minutes. Cameroon advanced to the World Cup. Nigeria's protest to FIFA was dismissed. The border dispute festered for another decade, eventually requiring International Court of Justice intervention. The 1990 qualifier remains a case study in how a sporting event can amplify pre-existing hostilities, turning a pitch into a flashpoint. The Leningrad Siege Match, 1942. By the spring of that year, Leningrad had been encircled by German forces for over 8 months. The civilian death toll from starvation and shelling had already climbed past 600,000. The city was a frozen graveyard of stalled trams and collapsed buildings. In this landscape, the idea of a football match was not a sporting event. It was a calculated act of psychological warfare designed to signal to both the Germans and the city's own starving population that Leningrad was still alive. The mechanism was pure propaganda. German propaganda leaflets had boasted that the dead city was so broken, not even a dog could run through its streets. A public display of organized physical exertion, broadcast via loudspeakers and frontline reports, would refute that claim directly. The logic was simple. If men can still run, the city can still fight. The match was organized by the city's party leadership and the NKVD. Players were pulled from military units and factories. They were skeletal. One key figure was Dynamo Leningrad's former captain, Valentin Fyodorov, who was recalled from a supply route on Lake Ladoga. The participants suffered from severe dystrophy. A standard 90-minute match was impossible because their bodies lacked the caloric reserves for sustained aerobic output. The solution was to shorten the halves to 30 minutes each and eliminate physical contact to prevent fractures in bones weakened by malnutrition. The simple act of sprinting caused torn muscles that could not heal. The game was played on the reserve field of the Dynamo Stadium on May 31st, between Dynamo and a team representing the Leningrad metal plant. Accounts differ on the exact score, but the match finished. It was interrupted by a German artillery barrage, forcing the players to take cover before resuming play. The sound of the game's radio commentary, mixed with the echo of explosions, was the real product. It was a sonic message of defiance. The match did not save a single life from hunger, but it neutralized a specific enemy narrative. The city's will to resist was publicly demonstrated on a patch of torn grass by men who could barely stand. The 1934 World Cup, Mussolini's propaganda tool. The tournament ran in Italy from late May to early June 1934. Benito Mussolini had been in power for over a decade. For him, this was not a sporting event. It was a stage. The Italian government assigned a budget of 3.5 million lire. The fascist regime wanted a global audience to witness Italian supremacy. The logic was simple. Victory on the pitch would prove the strength of the fascist system itself. The psychology of the state merged athletic success with national destiny. Losing was not an option. Mussolini personally selected referees for Italy's matches. The Italian team manager Vittorio Pozzo received direct pressure. The famous win or die telegram, whether real or a myth amplified later, captured the atmosphere. Players understood the stakes. The quarterfinal against Spain descended into a brutal affair. Injuries took out Spain's legendary goalkeeper, Riccardo Zamora. Italian Mario Pizziolo suffered a broken leg, ending his international career. Italy won the replay 1-0 after a physically crushing performance. In the final, Czechoslovakia led 1-0 with 10 minutes left. Italy equalized, then scored again in extra time. The trophy stayed in Rome. The regime packaged the triumph as proof of concept. 2 years later, Italy won Olympic gold. 4 years later, they defended the World Cup in France. The 1934 tournament set a template for state-captured sport that would echo through the 20th century. The 1973 coup d'etat in Chile in the National Stadium. On September 11, 1973, the military ousted President Salvador Allende. Within hours, the Estadio Nacional in San Diego transformed from a sports venue into a mass detention center. The logic was grim spatial efficiency. A stadium is a ready-made enclosure with high walls, segregated sections, and a capacity for tens of thousands. It required no construction, just a change of function. Soldiers locked the gates and turned the stands into cages. Between 12 and 20,000 people were held here over 2 months. The field and galleries held men. Women were packed into the swimming pool, changing rooms, and adjacent buildings. The velodrome became an interrogation center. The Red Cross estimated 7,000 prisoners occupied the stadium at a single point, around 300 of them foreigners. The structure of the facility mirrored a system of classification and processing. Corridors and locker rooms served as prison cells. Interrogators worked through lists, pulling individuals for questioning. Survivor testimonies collected by humanitarian groups described torture and mock executions. Some detainees were shot on the grounds, others were taken to unknown locations and never returned. The Chilean Football Federation faced a surreal bureaucratic problem during this period. FIFA President Sir Stanley Rouse insisted the Soviet Union team play a World Cup qualifier at the stadium. The USSR refused. Chile qualified automatically for the 1974 World Cup by default. In 2011, authorities set aside a section of old wooden bleachers, Escatilla No. 8, as a memorial. It is surrounded by a barbed wire fence. The stadium's concrete and steel held no political ideology, but its architecture made it an instrument of state terror. The 1989 Hillsborough disaster and its cover-up. On April 15, 1989, an FA Cup semi-final between Liverpool and Nottingham Forest at Sheffield's Hillsborough Stadium became the deadliest sporting event in British history. The Leppings Lane end, allocated to Liverpool supporters, was a standing terrace, divided into pens by steel fencing, a standard response to the hooliganism epidemic of the 1980s. The central pens, accessed through a narrow tunnel, had a stated capacity that was never updated after layout changes invalidated the stadium's safety certificate in 1979. Outside, a bottleneck formed at the turnstiles as kickoff approached. Match commander, Chief Superintendent David Duckenfield, newly promoted and inexperienced in this role, ordered exit gate C opened to relieve the crush. Over 2,000 fans surged through, funneling directly into the already packed central pens. The physics of a crowd crush is brutal. Once density exceeds 6 or 7 people per square meter, individuals lose control of their movement, shock waves ripple through compressed bodies, and breathing becomes impossible due to pressure on the chest. Within minutes, 94 men, women, and children were dead from compressive asphyxia. The match was abandoned at 3:06 p.m. In the immediate aftermath, South Yorkshire police fed false stories to the press, claiming drunken ticketless Liverpool fans had stormed the gates. The 1990 Taylor report proved the cause was a catastrophic failure of police crowd control, yet the first inquests returned verdicts of accidental death. A 27-year fight by bereaved families finally led to new inquests, concluding in 2016 that the 97 victims were unlawfully killed due to gross negligence by the police and ambulance services. The Nazi salute match, England versus Germany, 1938. On May 14, 1938, at Berlin's Olympic Stadium, 110,000 spectators watched England play Germany in a friendly. The British Foreign Office ordered the English players to perform a Nazi salute during the German anthem. The gesture was a calculated act of appeasement. 2 months earlier, Germany had annexed Austria. The salute was meant to signal that Germany was not a pariah state, smoothing the path for Neville Chamberlain's negotiations with Hitler. The players complied, though later accounts suggest reluctance, bordering on mutiny. A photograph of the raised arms circulated globally, becoming an enduring image of sport subordinated to diplomacy. England won 6-3, but the result was secondary. For Hitler, the propaganda value outweighed the defeat. German writer Ulrich Linder noted that losing to England was unremarkable at the time, as England dominated international football. The match effectively helped legitimize the Nazi regime on the world stage, just months before the invasion of Czechoslovakia. It was the last meeting between the two nations before the Second World War. The spectacle of English footballers saluting the swastika remains a chilling prelude to the conflict that would soon engulf Europe. The 2002 Battle of Nablus, football stadium as military base. In April 2002, during the Second Intifada, Israeli forces launched Operation Defensive Shield, a large-scale incursion into West Bank cities. Nablus, a dense urban center with a population of over 150,000, became a focal point. The operation aimed to dismantle militant infrastructure after a series of suicide bombings. The Nablus football stadium, a municipal venue normally hosting local matches, was seized and repurposed. Its open field, surrounded by high walls and stands, offered a ready-made containment area. Hundreds of Palestinian men, rounded up in house-to-house searches, were brought there. They were forced to sit on the grass for hours, blindfolded and handcuffed, while Israeli intelligence officers conducted interrogations. The stadium's layout allowed for easy surveillance and control. Exits could be sealed, and the stands provided elevated positions for armed guards. This was not a random choice. The stadium's architecture mirrored a prison yard, minimizing escape risk and maximizing processing efficiency. Detainees were screened for suspected militants, with many later transferred to formal detention centers. The incident drew international condemnation, with human rights groups citing the use of a civilian sports facility for mass detentions as a violation of the laws of war. The stadium itself sustained no physical damage, but its symbolic transformation from a place of recreation to a site of mass incarceration underscored the deep entanglement of conflict and everyday life in the occupied territories. After the operation, the stadium returned to its original use, though the memory of those days lingered in the community. Football's hidden history is a ledger of ceasefires and ambushes, where the pitch served as both sanctuary and trap. If you enjoyed this video, leave a like and subscribe to the channel. Drop your idea for the next episode in the comments.